Bryan Kohberger's name once echoed only in classrooms, where his professors and classmates saw him as a quiet, intelligent student. But behind the silence lay questions too dark to ignore, questions that one professor now reveals for the very first time. Bryan Kohberger's presence on campus was something that most students hardly noticed at first. But for those who spent enough time around him, there was an unsettling edge to his silence. He often lingered in the back of lecture halls, scribbling in notebooks with a focus that felt almost unnatural. While many of his classmates treated criminology as a path to law enforcement careers or academic research, Bryan seemed to live inside the subject. It wasn't just study for him, it was an obsession. He read case files late into the night, dissecting every move of infamous killers, noting what they did right, where they slipped, and how investigators eventually caught them. Some professors praised his meticulous research, calling him one of the most prepared students they had ever taught. But behind the admiration was a quiet discomfort that nobody voiced aloud. In group projects, he rarely spoke unless he had to, and when he did, his words carried a sharpness that sometimes left others uneasy. He critiqued his peers with a precision that felt less like collaboration and more like dissection. The few who partnered with him described the experience as draining, as though they had been placed under a microscope themselves. Yet when it came to presenting material, Bryan thrived. His voice, calm and measured, carried an unsettling authority. He spoke about crime scenes as though he had walked through them himself, pointing out details others had missed, predicting outcomes that often mirrored real-world cases. His professors admired the accuracy, but some couldn't shake the thought that his insight came from more than just reading. Outside of class, Bryan kept to himself. He avoided social gatherings and instead gravitated toward late-night study sessions in the library, where the silence suited him. Students occasionally caught glimpses of him pacing the aisles, murmuring as he reviewed his notes, as though rehearsing conversations only he could hear. His essays grew longer with every assignment, filled with exhaustive breakdowns of behavior, motive, and method. It wasn't unusual for a criminology student to dive deep into criminal psychology, but Bryan's work stood apart. He didn't just analyze crimes, he reconstructed them, step by step, with chilling precision. Every choice the offender made, every mistake, every moment of hesitation was captured as though he had been present when it happened. Over time, those around him began to notice his fixation on one recurring theme: control. Whether he was writing about serial offenders, stalkers, or criminal masterminds, the central thread was always how they controlled their victims, the crime scene, and even the narrative that followed. For Bryan, control wasn't just an aspect of crime, it was the essence of it. His notes often circled back to how small, deliberate choices created patterns that law enforcement failed to see. He seemed less fascinated by justice and more by the art of remaining unseen. This perspective, though masked as academic curiosity, hinted at something deeper, something darker. The halls of the department buzzed with laughter and chatter from students balancing work with youthful energy, but Bryan stood apart like a shadow. His professors knew he was intelligent, possibly even brilliant, yet brilliance without empathy is a dangerous thing. And while no one said it then, a sense of unease began to grow quietly around him, like a whisper building toward something no one wanted to acknowledge. Dr. Miller had taught hundreds of students over the years, yet something about Bryan demanded more of his attention than he wanted to admit. At first, he told himself it was because of the students' discipline and sharp intellect. Bryan came to class prepared, his notes neatly arranged, his questions always relevant. But as the semester dragged on, those questions shifted in tone. Instead of asking about theory or research methods, Bryan pressed for explanations about how criminals operated in the real world. He wanted to know about the small details, the parts that rarely made it into textbooks, what kind of evidence police tended to overlook, how long investigators might take to link a suspect to a crime, or what mistakes offenders made that gave them away. It was clear that he wasn't satisfied with surface-level information. He dug deeper, circling back to topics as though he couldn't let them go. At first, Dr. Miller thought this was ambition. Many of his students dreamed of joining law enforcement or working as profilers. Passionate curiosity was expected. But with Bryan, there was a weight to his interest. He didn't ask how to solve crimes. He asked how they could be carried out without leaving traces. During one lecture on forensic limitations, he pressed so hard for answers about DNA transfer and contamination that other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Miller answered cautiously, keeping to the academic framework, but the intensity in Bryan's eyes lingered with him long after the class ended. Assignments became another window into his mind. When tasked with analyzing historical cases, most students gave straightforward breakdowns of evidence and police work. Bryan, however, reconstructed the crimes in eerie detail, highlighting decisions the perpetrators made and suggesting alternative methods they could have used to avoid detection. His essays read less like analysis and more like instruction manuals. Dr. Miller marked them with high grades because the research was thorough, but unease grew every time he picked up Bryan's work. It was as though the student wasn't studying crime from the outside, but rather mapping it from within. Outside of assignments, Bryan lingered after class, often when the room had emptied and silence hung in the air. He asked Dr. Miller about criminal psychology, not in broad strokes, but in pointed, precise queries. How do offenders maintain composure under questioning? What strategies do they use to blend in? How can someone erase their digital trail? Dr. Miller tried to deflect, offering responses framed in ethical boundaries, yet Bryan always pushed further. These weren't the questions of a student eager to catch criminals. They were the questions of someone trying to understand how to avoid becoming one. Dr. Miller found himself thinking about Bryan at odd times, replaying their conversations. He told himself it was paranoia, the product of spending decades steeped in crime research. But still, he felt something wasn't right. He began to notice how Bryan's body language in class never quite matched the energy of his peers. He sat stiffly, his face void of expression, his gaze sharp and unblinking. It was as if he were studying everyone else, cataloging their movements the same way he dissected case studies. The rest of the department praised Bryan's dedication. He seemed like a model student, intelligent, focused, committed to his field. But Dr. Miller's unease deepened with every passing week. He couldn't pinpoint a single act of wrongdoing, nothing concrete that he could present as a concern. All he had were instincts, small signals that something in Bryan's pursuit of knowledge was skewed, and so he stayed silent, even as the shadows around this particular student grew darker and more defined. Months before Bryan's arrest, Dr. Miller had a moment of hesitation that he would later revisit in his mind again and again. It was late in the semester when he sat down to grade a stack of essays, exhausted from back-to-back lectures and administrative work. Among the pile was Bryan's latest project, a paper that immediately felt different from the rest. Instead of focusing on theoretical analysis, Bryan had constructed a chillingly detailed scenario of multiple unsolved murders. He broke down every step of the imagined crimes, the choice of location, the method of approach, the elimination of evidence, and even the calculated silence afterward. Each page was filled with a cold precision that made Dr. Miller pause more than once. It was not just the subject matter that unsettled him, but the voice in which it was written. The paper didn't sound like it came from a researcher looking in. It read like a participant recounting the act with calculated detachment. He closed the folder, pushed it aside, and sat quietly in his office for a long time. A gnawing feeling told him that this was not normal, not the kind of work a student should be producing. That night, instead of filing the paper away, he opened his faculty journal and wrote a short note about Bryan. It was not an official complaint or report, just a private entry in which he tried to articulate what he had been feeling all semester. He described Bryan's unusual focus on control, his lack of empathy in discussing victims, and the unsettling way his essays leaned toward practical detail rather than critical analysis. He wrote that the student seemed overly invested in the mechanics of crime and detached from human consequence. It was the first time he admitted, even to himself, that his concern had grown into something more than passing discomfort. For a few days afterward, the thought of raising the issue to the department chair hovered in his mind. He even drafted an email once but never sent it. The academic calendar pressed forward, filled with deadlines, conferences, and meetings that left little room for what felt like a vague hunch. He convinced himself he might be overreacting. After all, criminology attracted students fascinated by dark subjects. How could he justify elevating suspicion based on writing style and unsettling questions? Without concrete evidence, bringing it up risked labeling a promising student unfairly. The thought of damaging someone's academic career on the basis of instinct felt reckless. So the journal entry remained locked in his drawer, gathering dust beneath the weight of unspoken worry. Yet the memory of that paper lingered. Every so often, Dr. Miller would recall specific passages, lines where Bryan had written about eliminating digital footprints or disguising movements in public. He remembered the uncomfortable realization that these weren't broad observations, but exact, technical steps that someone could conceivably follow. It struck him that Bryan's interest was less about catching criminals and more about refining the blueprint of one. When news of the murders broke months later, the journal entry resurfaced in his mind like a wound ripped open. He realized that he had noticed something, even written it down, yet buried it under the noise of academia. It wasn't simply that he failed to act. It was that he had allowed the possibility of danger to vanish into routine. That forgotten note, hidden in a drawer, became a silent reminder of how close he had come to raising the alarm, and how far he had fallen from trusting his own instincts. It was the kind of oversight that would come to define his regret in the years that followed. The morning Bryan's arrest made national headlines. Dr. Miller sat frozen in front of his television. The face staring back at him from the screen was familiar, too familiar. He had seen that same blank expression sitting quietly in his lecture hall, the same sharp eyes narrowing whenever a discussion about criminal intent surfaced. As reporters described the details of the shocking murders, a chill crawled up his spine. The uneasy thoughts he had tucked away for months came rushing back with crushing weight. Every paper, every question, every late-night conversation in an empty classroom suddenly aligned in a way he wished they never had. What once seemed like academic intensity now looked like foreshadowing. He replayed their interactions in his mind, searching for the moment where he should have acted, the instant where his instincts told him to speak up, but his professional caution held him back. The news spread quickly across campus. Students whispered in hushed tones, recalling fragments of conversations with Bryan, each trying to make sense of how the quiet student in their midst could be connected to something so horrifying. Faculty members avoided speculation in public, but behind closed doors, questions mounted. How could no one have seen it coming? How had the department missed the signs? Dr. Miller, more than anyone, felt the sting of those unspoken accusations. He alone knew he had written down his suspicions, even if only in private. The journal in his drawer was no longer just a collection of thoughts. It was a reminder of silence, of warnings unspoken and instincts ignored. Days turned into weeks, and the media presence only intensified. Reporters camped outside the university, digging for stories about Bryan's time as a student. The department issued carefully worded statements, framing him as a complex individual who had shown both promise and difficulty, but avoiding any direct acknowledgement of red flags. Dr. Miller found himself trapped between two worlds: the academic environment that valued restraint and neutrality, and the moral weight of knowing that his hesitation may have cost lives. Each time he saw Bryan's face in the news, the guilt pressed heavier on his chest. What disturbed him most were the memories he couldn't push aside. The essay that had detailed unsolved murders, the relentless questions about avoiding detection, the unnerving fixation on control. These weren't just oddities of a curious student. They had been clues, pieces of a larger picture that he had been too cautious to assemble. He realized now that he had mistaken detachment for professionalism, telling himself it wasn't his place to jump to conclusions. But the cost of silence had revealed itself in the worst possible way. In the solitude of his office, Dr. Miller pulled out the journal and reread the entry. The words felt like a confession, his own acknowledgement that he had seen something dangerous brewing. For the first time, he felt less like a professor reflecting on a student, and more like a witness who had ignored the signs of a storm before it struck. Breaking through the numbness, a thought took root. He could not keep this inside any longer. His silence had already stretched too far, and the weight of it was beginning to feel unbearable. It was time to speak, no matter how late, no matter how painful. When Dr. Miller finally agreed to sit down for an interview, he felt the kind of nervous energy that comes before a confession. The cameras were set up, the lights burned hot against his skin, and the silence of the room made his heartbeat sound louder than it should. For months he had carried the weight of what he knew, and now there was no turning back. He spoke slowly at first, careful with each word. But once the memories started flowing, the restraint he had practiced for so long began to dissolve. He described Bryan not as the promising student many assumed him to be, but as someone whose curiosity for crime edged far beyond the boundaries of academic study. He recalled the essays that read like instruction manuals, the unsettling way Bryan probed into the mechanics of concealment, and the lack of empathy that colored his research. To the outside world, these details were shocking. But to Dr. Miller, they were reminders of the storm he had ignored. As the interview unfolded, he admitted his deepest regret. He had seen signs and chosen not to act. He explained how he once wrote down his concerns in his private journal, describing Bryan's fixation on control and his eerie detachment, but left the note hidden instead of raising his voice. He confessed that he drafted an email to the department chair but never sent it, afraid of being wrong, afraid of jeopardizing a student's future on the basis of instinct alone. That hesitation now haunted him, and as he spoke, it was clear the guilt had carved itself deeply into his life. Each detail he revealed was not only about Bryan E.'s behavior, but about his own failure to respond when it might have mattered most. The interviewer pressed gently, asking what made him finally come forward. Dr. Miller explained that silence had become unbearable. Every time he saw the victims' faces on the news, every time their families spoke about their loss, he felt the crushing reminder that he had noticed something and buried it. He admitted that he would never know whether speaking up sooner could have changed the outcome, but the thought lingered like a shadow. It wasn't just Bryan's actions that terrified him now. It was how easily they had been disguised by intellect, how ambition and focus had masked something far darker. He spoke about the larger issue, too, widening the scope beyond his own guilt. He warned that academia often encourages detachment, pushing professors to analyze without feeling, to separate themselves from instinct in the name of professionalism. But, he said, when instincts whisper loudly enough, ignoring them can carry devastating consequences. Evil does not always present itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it hides in quiet students, in polished essays, in conversations that feel slightly off, but not incriminating enough to confront. His message was clear. Vigilance must extend beyond research and theory into the uncomfortable space of human intuition. By the end of the interview, Dr. Miller's voice had softened, carrying the weight of exhaustion. He said he did not tell his story to shift blame or seek attention, but because silence had already done too much damage. He wanted others to understand how danger can live in plain sight, how it can slip unnoticed through classrooms, libraries, and offices until it explodes into something irreversible. As the cameras clicked off and the room returned to silence, Dr. Miller knew his words could not undo the past, but speaking them aloud was its own form of reckoning. The truth, even delivered late, was his only way to confront the shadow he had once ignored.